Good evening, everyone. Good evening to my lecturer and fellow classmates. Today, our group will be present in Chapter 9, Incoterms. Before I start, I hope you guys can lend me your ears, your eyes, and concentration during the presentation. So, let's get started. What is Incoterms? Have you guys heard about it? Have you guys familiar with the word Incoterms? Some might be, some not. Okay, so Incoterms, known as International Commercial Terms, and published by the International Chamber of Commerce (ICC) since 1936. The headquarters are in Paris. Incoterms is a series of international sales terms used in the international commercial transaction. It is including the rights and obligation of the parties in the contract of sale with the delivery goods process. So, why is the Incoterms are very vital in international trade? Because it can reduce or eliminate uncertainties that normally arise due to misunderstanding or misinterpretation between parties in two different countries. So, when we are doing international trading activities, all the uncertainties like risks or damages can be reduced or avoided by using Incoterms. There are 5 functions of Incoterms. The first one, to determine the critical point in transfer of risk from the exporter to the importer in the process of delivering goods. Example of risks are risk of good loss, deterioration, and robbery of goods. Hence, by using Incoterms, it can allow the person in charge to prepare for an insurance. Number 2, to specify who is going to subscribe the contract of carriage. It can be the exporter or the importer who is liable to pay for the carriage. Number 3, to distribute the logistic and administrative expenses between the exporter and the importer. Number 4, to demarcate or separate who is responsible for the packaging, marking, operation of handling, loading, unloading, and inspection of goods. Number 5, to confirm and fix respective obligation for the formalities of exportation and importation, payments of right, taxes of importation, and sending documents. These functions make the international trade activities more smoother and help the traders to understand one another in different countries. There are 11 Incoterms that we must know, which we will discuss further later. As in the book, it stated Incoterms 2010. However, it has been revised and become Incoterms 2020. Although there is a slightly different from Incoterms 2010 to Incoterms 2020, but it can affect a lot to the traders. To be short, the Incoterms make the traders more understand in the terms of cost, who is responsible for the expenses in delivery process, control, who is legal possession of the goods, and liability, who is responsible for paying damage of goods while in the shipment transit. For example, I choose one of the 11 Incoterms stated, like in this picture, FOB, free on board. This term means exporter deliver goods at a named port, then from that port, all the cost, control, and liability is under the importer. In other words, the importer will have a legal possessions of the shipment, and the importer also need to bear all the damages if anything happens while the goods is in the transit.
So now, let's move to purpose and scope of Incoterms. Purpose of Incoterms: to provide a set of international rules for the interpretation of the most commonly used trade terms in foreign trade. Thus, the uncertainties of different interpretations of such terms in different countries can be avoided or at least reduced to a considerable degree. It should be stressed that the scope of Incoterms is limited to the rights and obligations of the parties arising from the delivery of the sale of goods. Incoterms do not define the goods, but the goods should be understood as commodities. Other than that, Incoterms do not regulate any contract other than sale contract. However, even in a sale contract, Incoterms do not cover all the contractual specs. The topics that Incoterms govern can be gathered under 4 groups, which are the delivery of goods, transfer of risk, division of cost, and obligation concerning the documents. Moreover, Incoterms also do not provide rules for the payment and payment methods, transfer of ownership, variance, dispute resolution, and other issues relating to fulfillment of the contract. There are 2 particular misconceptions about Incoterms. First, Incoterms are frequently misunderstood as applying to the contract of carriage rather than to the contract of sale. Other than that, they are sometimes wrongly assumed to provide for all the duties which parties may wish to include in a contract of sale.
For the structure of Incoterms, there are 11 kinds of Incoterms in total. There are 4 groups of Incoterms, which are Group E, Group F, Group C, and Group D. In the first group of E terms, EXW is also called X words, as well, where the seller only makes the goods available to the buyer at the seller's own premise. For the second group, F terms, free carrier, free alongside ship, and free on board, where the seller is called to deliver the goods to a carrier appointed by the buyer. The third group includes the C terms, which are cost of freight, carriage paid to, and lastly, carriage and insurance paid to, where the seller has to contract for carriage without assuming the risk of loss or damage to the goods or additional costs due to events occurring after shipment and dispatch. The last one is Group D, consists of delivered duty paid, delivered at terminal, and delivered at place, whereby the seller has to bear all costs and risks needed to bring the goods to the place of destination.
So we have looked at the structure of Incoterm, and now let me explain more the term that involved in Incoterm groups. The only term that involved in Group E is the XW or X works. The buyer bears all risks and costs starting when it picks up the products at the seller's location or other named place until the products are delivered to the final locations. EX work is one of the most common Incoterms used. In terms of simplicity and convenience, it mostly favors the seller. Once he sells the goods to the buyer, the only thing left is to package them and transport them to the arranged location. Moving on to the Group F, first is FCE or Free Carrier. Under this term, it is the seller obligations to hand over the goods over the first carrier at the named place once they have been cleared for export. Or the other meaning is, the seller would have fulfilled their obligations once the goods had been cleared for export and delivered from the seller's warehouse to the carrier waiting at the named port. Next is FAS or Free Alongside Ship. Seller clears the goods for export and delivers them when the goods are placed alongside the vessel at the named port of shipment. This means that the seller is responsible for all costs and risks to the goods up to point of delivery. FAS is usually followed by a place name, for example, FAS San Francisco. The place name indicates the port where the goods are to be delivered on the quay beside the carrier ship. This is applicable only for maritime transport, typically used for heavy lift or bulk cargo. But if the goods are handed to the carrier in a container terminal, FCA is a more appropriate term. Thirdly is FOB or Free on Board. The term free refers to the supplier's obligation to deliver its goods to a specific location, later to be transferred to a carrier. In other words, the supplier is free of responsibility. On board simply means that the goods are on the ship. FOB shipping means that the supplier retains ownership and responsibility for the goods until they are loaded on board a shipping vessel. Once the good on the ship, the risk of loss and damage to the good passes to the buyers, and the buyers bears all costs from that moment onwards. In Group C, it consists of 4 Incoterms, which are CFR, CIF, CPT, and CIP. Firstly, we look at the CFR and CIF. CFR is cost and freight, while CIF is cost, insurance, and freight. Both of them have the same cost and risk responsibilities, where sellers are responsible for the cost until the cargo arrives at the importing port. In terms of risk responsibilities, sellers are responsible until the cargo is loaded onto a vessel at the exporting port. Once cargo is loaded onto a vessel, it becomes the buyer's responsibility. The seller must contract for and pay the cost and freight necessary to bring the goods to the named port of destination. With CIF, it is the responsibility of the exporter to arrange insurance. The seller also contracts for insurance cover against the buyer risk of loss or damage to the goods during the carriage. The buyer should note that under CIF, the seller is required to obtain insurance only on minimum cover. Should the buyer wish to have more insurance protection, it will need either to agree as much expressly with the seller or to make its own extra insurance arrangement. CFR does not include any insurance, therefore, the importer will either waive insurance or they will arrange their own insurance. Next is CPT and CIP. CPT is carriage paid to and CIP is carriage and insurance paid to. In CPT, the seller is responsible for arranging carriage to the named place. CIT is quite similar to CPT, except in CIT, the seller is also responsible for insuring the goods to the named place. For both terms, the risk passes when the goods are handed over to the first carrier. Moving on to the Group D, first is DAT, which is delivered at terminal. DAT requires the seller to place the goods that have been unloaded from the vessel but not yet gone through customs clearance at the destination country's terminal, port, or airport. Thus, the seller is responsible for all costs and risks up to the unloading of goods at the terminal. And next is DAP, which is delivered at place. The seller delivers when the goods are placed at the disposal of the buyer on the arriving means of transport, ready for unloading at the named place of destination. Under DAP terms, the risk passes from the seller to buyer from the point of destination mentioned in the contract of delivery. Once goods are ready for shipment, the necessary packing is carried out by the seller at their own cost, so that the goods reach their final destination safely. All necessary legal formalities in the exporting country are completed by the seller at their own cost and risk to clear the goods for export. After arrival of the goods in the country of destination, the customs clearance in the importing country needs to be completed by the buyer, for example, like import permit or documents required by the customs. Next is DDP, which is delivered duty paid. Seller is responsible for delivering the goods to the named place in the country of the buyer and pays all costs in bringing the goods to the destination, including import duties and taxes. The seller is not responsible for unloading. This term places the maximum obligations on the seller and minimum obligations on the buyer. No risk or responsibility is transferred to the buyer until delivery of the goods at the named place of destination. The most important consideration for DDP terms is that the seller is responsible for clearing the goods through customs in the buyer's country, including both paying the duties and taxes and obtaining the necessary authorizations and registration from the authorities in that country. The International Chamber of Commerce reviews and updates the Incoterms rule every 10 years. The previous edition was published in 2010. It responds to concerns raised by users of Incoterms and to change in the markets to ensure the terms are relevant and suitable to both domestic and global trade. On 1st January 2020, the new Incoterms 2020 went into effect. These new terms were released by the International Chamber of Commerce in September of 2019. So, what are the main changes in Incoterms 2020 and 2010? First is FCA on-board bill of lading for sellers options. It means in the Incoterms 2010, rules who was responsible for the on-board bill of lading was not defined and had to clarify in the contract if the FCA option was chosen. As this leads to the confusion, the new 2020 rules make it clear the buyer should instruct the carrier or its agent to release the bill of lading on the seller's behalf. The bill of lading will have a notation of on board or aboard that states the goods have been loaded on the vessel. The bill of lading is one of the most common documents and is used to release payment if you are paying by letter of credit. Second is DAT has changed to DPU, which is delivered at place unloaded. In Incoterms 2010, DAT means the goods are delivered once unloaded at the named terminal. As DAT limits the place of delivery to a terminal, in Incoterms 2020, the reference to terminal has been removed to make it more general. DPU means delivered at place unloaded, which can now be used for all modes of transportation. There is no other change. Thirdly is new insurance rules for CIF and CIP. There are some changes to CIF and CIP, which are the only two Incoterms that define who is to pay for insurance. For both CIF and CIP, the insurance is to be paid by the seller. Previously, the seller was only responsible for the minimum insurance requirements. However, in the new rules, the seller has to purchase insurance for the shipments to at least 110% of the value of the goods. Next is greater clarify on who is responsible for what. The new 2020 clarify which party is, the buyer or seller, is responsible for custom clearance, which party is responsible for the payments, and who is to assume the risk and insurance costs. The new rules were rewritten to use less technical jargon and to be easier to understand. It tried to make the rules as clear as possible while still being legally enforceable in a multinational legal contract. Lastly is DIY transport option. For the first time, the new Incoterms now recognize that both the buyer and seller can transport the goods themselves using their own vehicles. In the previous version, the rules assumed that the transportation would exclusively be handled by a third-party shipping service. Basically, this means that they recognize that the buyer can now pick up goods using their personal vehicle from a port or terminal destination. This update only affects on the FCA, DAP, DPU, and DDP. That is all from us. Thank you.